Hi, welcome to the settlement lecture. We're going to do this in two parts. This is part one, the first migration. Before we even get into settlement, I want to deal with sources of knowledge because this is important when we sort of look at the very core construct of Hawaiian studies, which is trying to unravel the question in the beginning of where do Hawaiians come from? Where do we come from? So looking at sources of knowledge is going to be important to understand and to be able to answer that question. So we really have broken it up here, as you see, into internal and external sources. On internal sources, really what we're talking about are native, aboriginal, or indigenous sources of knowledge. In essence, what we say about ourselves. Yama koiho. And when we're talking about internal sources of knowledge, we're really talking about traditional mo'olelo or stories, chants, things like that, internal histories of any Pacific island, versus external knowledge, which are non-native, non-Aboriginal, or non-Indigenous sources of knowledge. And in a sense, what they say about us, what people from the outside in say. Mostly pre-20th century scholarship. And if you notice on the bottom as well, there are pluses and minuses for each, which means that there are good and bad in both of these categories. One is not perfect and the other is not absolutely not perfect. But I like to think that in modern scholarship, both internal and external sources of knowledge suffuse together or combine to produce something really good, really positive. And what I'm trying to get at is that internal sources of knowledge like mo'olelo are also supported by other forms of scientific research that we're going to read about, like migration timelines, settlement patterns, Lapita pottery, all those sort of things help us to understand where Hawaiians come from. And both sources of knowledge, to me, are valuable. So let's begin with our Pacific. We're going to start with looking at geography and geology, okay? And you can see here our map of the Pacific broken into Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. We're going to have a few more nesias, but for now, let's cover a couple terms here. First term is geography, which, as you know, means spatial relationships, places, where things are, names of places and things like that. Geology is how things are formed. So the formation of Pacific Islands, how did they get here? Migration in time, so we're going to look at migration patterns, how people moved, where they moved. We're going to look at timelines for settlement in terms of thousands of years. We're going to look at settlement locations. So where did they settle? Where did they move to next? Did settlement happen in a single file line, like in a set course, or did it happen more like an explosive pattern? Which brings us to the last one of dispersal patterns, when and how people moved, then where they settled for different points of time. So in order to sort of get into it, we want to look at our nesias. So we have Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. We also have Indonesia, and something else that we can call Austronesia. So looking at the root, the Latin and Greek roots of these terms, our map of the Pacific was broken up into these regions, sort of placing people that aggregated more closely together than to one another to understand it. Melanesia meaning black islands. Mela, the root of which is melanin for skin pigment. Micronesia literally means small islands because the islands themselves are much more atolls than actual larger islands. Polynesia, which means many islands, and which has many island types. So large islands, small islands, and it's just a huge, vast area. Indonesia actually refers to the Indian islands. It's close to India, but is not India. It was given the name by mistake because when settlers first arrived there, they thought they had reached India. And that's what the origin of it is. Austronesia would literally mean southern islands. So we're going to get back to the term Austronesia later as it connects to our second migration, which are the Austronesians. Okay, so if we kind of put that on the map here, right, at least our first three, right, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, you can see that on this map here, there are these three major regions, and there's lines sort of dividing these regions, okay? Now, when source of external knowledge, right, were looking at the Pacific from the outside, they were trying to sort of understand its vast length. The Pacific Ocean is the largest body on the planet. And these regions are kind of divided so that whatever group kind of is more similar to each other than is not. And these lines sort of help us to understand what those regions are, but ultimately work against us. And if I were to look at Austronesia, this is what it would look like. From Madagascar to Easter Island, this is the totality of where our Austronesian settlers settled. So we can't understand anything about the Pacific in any sense of the word without understanding atolls. So in order to understand atolls, we're going to look at a particular atoll called Te Tiaroa. It's located in French Polynesia. You can see it just northeast of Tahiti. It's a small outlying atoll owned by the late Marlon Brando and is now a nature preserve. So if we were to look at Te Tiaroa Atoll, this is what it looks like. It has these islands, right? It has a reef, a barrier reef, and a lagoon on its interior. All atolls have this sort of island and barrier reef. Not all atolls have lagoons. However, when we do the key to understanding the geology of the Pacific are atolls, because they represent a specific phase in island formation, where islands sort of go through this underwater volcanic activity, protrusion and buildup above the surface, erosion from the elements, barrier reef and lagoon. So islands build up and eventually erode down till they go back below the surface again. The geology of the Pacific as a whole is a mixture of all these phases of island formation. Okay. Now let's look at our regions. Okay, so Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Realistically, we're talking about just key features, things that are just sort of broad brush elements. So Melanesia, for example, has large islands and short distances. Micronesia, small islands and short distances. Polynesia, large and small, large distances. So what does this mean? What's the significance? Well, the significance comes in settlement patterns. When people are moving throughout an ocean space, when they're looking for their next place to look over the horizon and find to settle, well, large islands and short distances actually becomes very, very, very meaningful. Often the difference between failure and success. Okay, and as we know, our Austronesians were highly, highly successful, so they knew how to adapt to these areas. Melanesia, large islands, short distances. Micronesia, small islands, short distances. Polynesia. So now that we have that down, I want to cover our first migration, which is basically happened 40,000 BP, was given the term Papuan, and the places that this first migration settled are Indonesia, Australia, Philippines, and part of Melanesia. Not the entire Melanesia, but part of it. They went over what we call the Sunda Shelf, and it was an overland migration. So when you hear the term overland migration, what you should be visualizing or thinking is that the first migration walked. Okay, it was not by sea, it was walking. So again, you can see a picture of what this Sunda Shelf looked like, and Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, right, Borneo, Sulawesi, and the Moluccas Islands, Papua, which was West Papua, or Irian Jaya, and Papua New Guinea over here, Philippines. And part of Melanesia, okay, up to the Bismarck Archipelago, which you see here, but not the rest. And this is the Sunda Shelf, and water level, ice age, sea level lower. And they reached all the way until this point, and that's where it stopped. And language and culture contact. Okay, that concludes this lecture on the first migration of R2. Use this space to take notes and to be able to answer the questions for this AQ. Aloha.